Welcome to the Writing 1 presentation on logical fallacies. You can follow along by turning to chapter 21 in your How to Write Anything book, the chapter on critical thinking. We will be using a little bit from some of the free materials that really aren't free. They're available to us through our book publisher because we do use this book, and I've used some of those in this presentation as well. Nothing you can really turn to with that, but just be aware. So what exactly are logical fallacies? Well, let's define them. Ruskowitz calls them rhetorical moves that corrupt solid reasoning. Hacker refers to them as misguided or dishonest use of legitimate argumentative strategies. The main idea here then is that these are rhetorical moves that are legitimate, rhetorical moves when they start off, but somehow they've either become cheap or they're kind of like dirty tricks, or they're not really showing logic. And that's one way to explain this, that if claims are supported by reasons and evidence, then logical fallacies are what happens when the reason and or evidence do not follow logic, reasoning, context, or the complete picture of information and evidence. And as we go through this, you'll realize sometimes you can find multiple logical fallacies in one statement. And oftentimes when we do exercises where I ask students to identify what is a logical fallacy in some example, oftentimes we'll identify several just from one example, and usually they're all correct to some degree. One type of logical fallacy is the appeal to false authority. And that pretty much means what the title would be calling it there, is that you're using sources that aren't credible. So in other words, you're giving authority to something that doesn't have that authority. Sometimes using sources with hidden agendas falls into this as well, because they shouldn't have authority on it because they've got a very specific thing that they're trying to accomplish. They've got a specific reason for doing it. So if you remember back when we were evaluating the sources, you remember that there is a website where they're talking about childhood obesity, and they're saying, oh, well, we make the argument that children should be allowed to drink soda. They should just also exercise. But one of their board members is a vice president of Coca-Cola, and he benefits from this whole idea of no, let the kids drink soda. So I would not really call him an authority on childhood obesity. And if you look at his background, that's not really anything he has expertise on. He just somehow serves on this board for some reason. Also, this includes using celebrities with no proven credibility on the topic. And some celebrities have really interesting, emotional, poignant, thoughtful ways of discussing issues, and that often happens. And oftentimes they say things or they're able to be involved with issues because of their power, their expertise in film or whatever. And they make enough money that it allows them to do these other projects, and that can be a really wonderful thing. But that does not mean that they are really credible on a specific topic. So they may care about education, but they never really learned anything about education. So that doesn't make them any kind of an authority. And when we appeal to that and say, oh, look, so-and-so, this actor in Hollywood, said this about our education system, well, that's all well and good, but that actor may not know anything. Another common logical fallacy is an ad hominem attack. Ad hominem is Latin for to the man or to the person, and it basically means that instead of addressing the ideas, you're attacking someone's personal integrity. You're attacking them personally. So that includes name calling, especially with controversial terms. So sometimes calling somebody a socialist, because in our country, socialist is seen as being kind of a dirty word. Again, in the 1950s, if you look back in history, we were fighting against the communists, and to call anyone even slightly a communist, even a socialist, which is not really the same thing as communism, but just to hint at someone like that was to basically call them a traitor to America. And so there were a lot of things like that going on. The same with if we call somebody a racist. That has a pretty significant heavy tag on that. And even hinting that someone might be a racist can really drag them down in the eyes of people. And so what sometimes happens, you see this especially with politics, people, rather than addressing the issue, they'll do things to attack each other. And you'll see that this is a very cheap and dirty way to go about things. It's interesting because many people complain about how many political advertisements do this. And some years when I'm teaching this, we are in a political season. We have plenty of attack ads we can look at on TV for examples. Other years, not so much, but we can still remember those political ads. And people complain about those. People talk about how much they hate the negative ads, but the reality is that they wouldn't run if they didn't work. And the reality is, unfortunately, people in general, the general public is very easily manipulated. Many of us probably listening to this are very easily manipulated, myself included, when we hear some of these attacks. So we need to be careful to see these for what they are. That includes something called character assassination. Again, that's claiming a moral high ground, claiming that you're more moral than the other person rather than addressing the issue itself. And many times people try to do this. They try to show somebody's being immoral and not a good person rather than talking about the ideas. Some examples that we see, I'm going with really basic examples. I'm not trying to come down on anyone's side on this, because I've seen this over the last 2 presidencies, that this happens from both sides. Both sides will put a picture of President Bush or President Obama with a Hitler mustache or in a Hitler uniform, like a Nazi uniform. And they're making the obvious statement there that this person is the same as Adolf Hitler. And because we in our history take Adolf Hitler very seriously and see him as pretty much a villain and is doing awful, awful things, then yeah, okay, we automatically react to that. Another one would be, again, back during President Bush's presidency, he had a past of cocaine use, and he was an alcoholic, and this is public information, and he didn't, some of these things were public information, and while he didn't deny them, he also didn't admit them. But they were out there, and pretty much anybody who could look into it would see that he was a cocaine user and an alcoholic in previous years. Obviously not when he was running for president, but people would bring this up repeatedly. Now, was he using cocaine when he was running for president? Pretty sure not. Was he an alcoholic when he ran for president? Again, pretty sure not. The signs were not there. So attacking him for that instead of the issues is cheap and dirty. Same with when people consistently refer to Barack Obama as Barack Hussein Obama, because Hussein is scary, right? Because of Saddam Hussein. Again, did he choose to have that name in his name? No. That's a very common name, especially where his father was from. It means nothing in terms of somebody's character, but people throw that in because they want to attack him rather than attacking ideas. And there are plenty of things about any candidate that you could attack their ideas and show how they're wrong, and if you're an intelligent person, that's what you do. But again, we know that people are often easily manipulated, so we want to avoid these ad hominem attacks, or else we're going to be seen as cheap and dirty. Another logical fallacy is dogmatism. This is when a writer gives the impression that she or he holds all the answers or represents the only reasonable set of values. So basically, if you're doing this, you're setting yourself up as only your side is a side that makes sense. Only your side is the sane, reasonable point of view, or the only moral point of view. That anybody who disagrees with you, no matter what they say, if they disagree with you, they're going to be wrong because you hold all the good cards. So an example would be, no serious person would disagree with blah, 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 or how can anyone argue blah, blah, blah. Again, this is kind of a cheap move. It doesn't really do anything for you. This logical fallacy is called Eitheror Choices. This is when you present your reader with A or B. You tell them you either do this or this happens, or either A happens or B happens. And we sometimes will call this a false dichotomy. Again, that's kind of a big word for separating things into two. Again, it's offering a choice of either A or B when other possibilities, often a compromise, exist. And people do this all the time, and it's a way of reducing complex, complicated situations to simplistic choices. So you basically show someone's either good or bad. Well, most of us know that we all are some of both. We all do things that are both good and bad. Again, right versus wrong. Either I'm right and you're wrong, or you're wrong and I'm right. You see what I did there? But people will do that kind of as a trick and as a way of getting people to think that there are only two choices. Again, liberty or tyranny. So either we vote this way, but if they invoke these laws, they're taking away all our rights and they're a bunch of tyrants and taking away our freedoms and they're anti-American. And you see there this kind of, again, you can combine multiple logical fallacies here, but that happens all the time. So again, either vote this way or you're anti-American would be one example that we see that. Another is you see this in advertisements. If you care about your dogs, you'll use our product. So either A, you care about your dogs, which means you use our product, or if you don't use our product, what? You don't care about your dogs. Again, we know that's not the truth, but that's still something that people use all the time. A very common logical fallacy that most of us have been exposed to, often repeatedly, and that's scare tactics. Basically what that means is that you're raising fear in order to manipulate your audience. And probably all of us have gone along with this at some point, right? Again, you can see this in the political realm. You see this a lot in the religious realm. You see this oftentimes even in the education realm, right? You know, where my way of trying to motivate you to do the work that I want you to do or to do the exercises is that I hang a grade over you. And, you know, I don't like to do that. I don't want to be manipulative. I want you to do your work and get things done for the right reasons. So I don't want to raise fear. Now, sometimes, yeah, we have to do this, especially with people who are very simple-minded. But for the most part, this is a logical fallacy. A lot of times it's combined with slippery slope, which we'll talk about later. And again, one example is behave the way I tell you to behave, or bad things will happen. So sometimes we use it in a very direct, you know, person-to-person way. You'll often see this with the cable news as well, and probably you get the impression that I don't think very well of cable news. And that's because a lot of times it's not, they might have a little bit of news on there, but usually they're trying to scare people. And this happens with the network news too. They're trying to scare people. Now, even if it's just scare them into buying this product or into voting this certain way or into following these certain politicians or these people who have ideas, that's often what happens is they get people afraid, and when you get people afraid, they look for someone they can follow. That's you know, manipulation 101. You see that even in personal relationships. So just be aware of this, and as you're looking through various sources, even ones that you agree with, be on the lookout for this scare tactic, and don't be afraid to identify that. And even if you're making an argument and if you're saying this, don't be afraid to point out, you know, I agree with this person, but he's using scare tactics, and we should get people to agree with us, not based on them being afraid and easily manipulated, but based on our logic and our reasons. Because oftentimes when we use emotions, especially fear, to manipulate people, well, they're easily manipulated the other way if they can be scared the other way. So again, it goes both ways. We don't want to do that. Emotional appeals in general, then, is what happens when you overemphasize emotion. And there are some other aspects of that too. But remember, emotional appeal is a legitimate rhetorical tool. We've talked about that. We've talked about pathos from literally like the first day of school, right? The first unit. And so it's a legitimate thing to do, but you don't want to abuse it. You don't want to overemphasize it. You don't want to substitute logic and evidence for emotion. So you don't want to replace your logic and evidence with emotion. Or what often happens is where you should have logic and evidence, instead you insert emotion. You don't want to do that. Oftentimes, manipulating people into making decisions or embracing ideas that they otherwise wouldn't. And again, we see this with a lot of commercials. We see this with politics. We see this all over our world, that people are manipulating other people, not because they're giving them good reasons and logic for things, but because people are easily manipulated, especially through the emotions. We don't want to do that. Oftentimes that gets into not just the emotions that we would think of, but that also gets into people's beliefs and values. And we appeal to people's beliefs and values because we know that that's a very soft spot, that's a sensitive spot for them. That's something where if we can make them think that our side is what best agrees with their beliefs and their values, then that's what we'll do. Well, that's kind of cheap, and again, that's not really convincing them to go along with us for the right reasons, is it? So oftentimes we use those appeals to help people decide against their better judgment. So things that might really serve their best interest, we'll say, well, you know, what we want to do, what we want to have them do, or a way that we want them to vote, a law we want them to support, that goes against their best interest. You often see people go into emotional manipulation too when there are some significant weaknesses in their argument, and the argument itself is not really going to hold its own. And the argument, you're not really substituting emotion for logic and reason and evidence because you don't have that logic and reason and evidence. And so you just insert some emotion in there and work people up without really making them think about it. The hasty generalization logical fallacy is when you're drawing conclusions from one or two examples that fit your own preconceived notion. Sometimes we think of this as stereotyping. This is when, something happens to you. So you take this one occurrence, this one example of something that happened to you, maybe it happened to you a couple of times, and you say, wow, that whole group of people is rude and inconsiderate. Well, you don't know that. You're just going off of the examples that you had. A lot of times this is where we have to be very careful about using personal stories with very little logical evidence. Especially many young writers, which would be, again, those of us in this class who are pretty early in our academic careers. Sometimes we put a lot of personal stories in to support our arguments, but just because this happened to you or your friend does not mean that it happened to everybody, or that illustrates some greater truth. Maybe the vast majority of people had a different experience. So again, that counts for very little. So you have to be careful about doing getting your conclusions from one or two examples that don't really prove the whole thing. One example is people would say, well, some teenagers who shot people at this school, well, they played violent video games and listened to a certain type of music. And so we need to regulate those video games and keep kids away from certain music. Well, again, out of the millions and millions of people who played those games and listened to that music, only a very, very few did this horrible, horrible, tragic thing. So we can't base our whole entire action just on one or two examples. Most of us have done papers or thought along the terms of cause and effect, and that's a fine way to think about things. That's a good way to argue. Our points are, this is the cause, this is the effect, some variation of that. And there's a whole chapter in the book that discusses, more strategies on how to do that well. But we need to make sure that the logic and the evidence do fit there. Oftentimes, issues are a lot more complicated than a simple, this is the cause and this is the effect way of explaining things. And that's what we call a faulty causality, is when we don't have a cause and effect that completely fit, and the logic and the evidence aren't there. So we can see there an example here. Since Governor Cho took office, unemployment of minorities is decreased by 7%. Governor Cho should be applauded for reducing unemployment of minorities. Well, if that's all you've said, then you've had a faulty causality here, because you haven't actually shown how Cho's policies are responsible for that. All you've done is just say that he took office or she took office and things changed. That doesn't mean anything. You need to get into specific details, show how the logic and evidence mesh together. Another one they hear sometimes is these TV preachers will say, the reason for this natural disaster is that God is judging us. Well, again, where do you find the logic and evidence there? How else could it be explained? Can you really prove that? That's a problem. So you want to make sure that your cause and effect match, and that you have plenty of logic and evidence to go along with them, or else you're falling into the faulty causality logical fallacy. Equivocations, evasions, and misstatements also fall into logical fallacy, though it's more a matter of just straight up lying, honestly. Equivocations are when lies, you make them look like proof, or like truth, so you're using statistics, but they might not be the right statistics, or they might be made up statistics, or maybe you got the statistics and you took them out of their proper context. There's a website called factcheck.org. It's an independent website having to do with a university, and they actually go through a lot of political speeches, especially during campaign seasons, and they find a lot of these things that happen. Sometimes people frame information to look like it proves something when really the situation is more complicated. So again, look for these. Be on the lookout for this when you're using your sources, whether you agree with them or not, to see where this might be the case. Sometimes there's what we call an evasion, and that's where people are just avoiding the truth entirely. So when you ask them a question, they don't actually answer the question, they start talking about something else. Again, usually that's when they would start talking about things that they know people want to hear about, like truth, freedom, justice, all this stuff, but they're not actually answering the question, so watch out for that. Another popular logical fallacy that people love to do is put up straw men. And what this means is that you're putting up easy or habitual targets that writers aim at to win an argument. Oftentimes these are things that don't really prove what you're trying to prove, or they've long been discredited. If you're on Facebook, or even before that with email, you've probably seen a lot of people post these things, and they're outrageous, and they're made to make people look bad. And oftentimes those things are not true. You can use Snopes, snopes.com, to help disprove some of those things. But again, there are these extreme examples, like welfare recipients driving Cadillacs, or immigrants taking jobs from hardworking citizens, rich not paying a fair share of taxes, things that can't really be proven, or things that have long been disproven. But people are going to use this to get people all riled up rather than actually, again, build their logic and evidence to support their reasons and their claims. Maybe the most popular logical fallacy out of all of them is a slippery slope. This is where the speaker or the writer warns, if you take one step in this direction, you're going to slide all the way down the hill. So if you do one small step, we make one bad decision or one little vote here, and it's going to lead to gloom and doom and apocalypse. So these really are generally not very accurate. Sometimes they're slightly accurate, or they could be accurate, but you can't prove them, or they're overstated. So, if we elect this guy, this country is just going to be completely communist in 10 years, or this country is going to go bankrupt, or whatever like that. Now, yeah, maybe you have a point that you want to make with that, and maybe it's a legitimate point that this person is not fiscally responsible, or that this person's policies disagree with where you think the country should be heading. But by exaggerating and overstating it like this, you've totally thrown your credibility out. Most of us are pretty familiar with the bandwagon appeal from sports. So, for example, when, someday when the Chicago Cubs start winning tons of games and going to the World Series, and suddenly all these people who are never Chicago Cubs fans will say they're Chicago Cubs fans. Okay, so I'm living a pipe dream there. But this happens with a lot of these teams that nobody cares about, but suddenly they get popular because they're winning. People are jumping on the bandwagon. What this means for us as a logical fallacy is when a writer or speaker or whatever, the way that they're trying to convince people is saying, well, everybody else is doing it. Everybody else is voting for this, or 70% of the American public feels that blah, 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 so we should vote this way. Again, that's not using logic and reason. Even in a democracy, we shouldn't do things simply because the majority rules, because the majority often changes its mind. We can look at things in the past where the majority thought something was good and true when we would disagree with that now. So again, you're substituting for logic and evidence with just simple, popularity. And then we have faulty analogies. And make sure you know what an analogy is. It's pointing out a similarity between two things that are otherwise different. And, we use analogies all the time, and oftentimes they're very good. We use them oftentimes in literature and creative writing, and we often use them to help people understand things. And that's a great thing. But a faulty analogy is that when we falsely assume that because two things are alike in one respect, they must be alike in others. So, for example, if we can send a spacecraft to Pluto, then we should be able to find a cure for the common cold. Well, okay, those are both related to science, and if we can do one thing in science, we should be able to do the other thing. Well, but they're completely different issues. They're completely different goals. They are not the same. So avoid that. Another one is, and I've seen this happen, people say Hitler was a vegetarian, so is this politician. And they're implying that because this person has one characteristic in common with Hitler, that they somehow are the same or close to the same. And again, you can see how this relates to another fallacy here. Think about it. Okay, so think about what that might be and get back to me on that. So you can see here faulty analogies. Again, we like to do this when we kind of run out of steam with our argument. We're losing our logic and evidence. So we throw in these faulty analogies to get people worked up. Now that you've gone through this presentation, you're ready for the practice activity, identifying logical fallacies. Have fun with that. I hope it's enjoyable for you. Remember when you do that many times you're going to identify multiple logical fallacies in the same statement. So don't get too nervous about picking the wrong one, because you're probably right. And then avoid these logical fallacies while you're working on your papers. And watch out for these logical fallacies when you're researching, because you're going to see them even in things that you agree with or in things that you disagree with. And then in your paper, it could be helpful for you to identify a logical fallacy in someone else's argument. So that's how you can apply this. All right, thank you for listening.